Please open up the Kaplan Chumash on your table to page 309, which is Exodus chapter 12. This occurs 2 weeks before the Exodus of Egypt on the 1st of Nisan. We read this last week, Parshas HaChodesh. Before, of course, the plague of the firstborns. This is 2 weeks before the Exodus, 2 weeks before the plague of the firstborns. Hashem, God addresses Moshe and Aaron, and he tells them, first he tells them the mitzvah of HaChodesh Ezer Lochem Reish Chadoshim, the mitzvah to establish a Jewish calendar, a lunar calendar, of which Nisan is the first month. He then goes on to say that the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, the mitzvah to for the Pesach sacrifice, the sheep, and specifically, he's not yet talking about doing this mitzvah in generations to come. He's talking about doing the mitzvah that very year. And as we shall see throughout the class today, that there were various differences between the mitzvah of Pesach that first year in Beis Halofim Tov Mem Ches, in the year that they left Egypt, versus the mitzvahs of Pesach as they are for generations to come. So, for example, that year they had to, as it says in verse 3 of chapter 12, on the 10th of this month, every man shall take a lamb for each extended family, right? So that year they had to prepare the lamb 4 days in advance. That did not apply for generations to come. Additionally, they had to put the blood on the doorposts. Again, something which wasn't going to happen in future generations. That was specifically for this year. Then if you look in verse 8, it says, eat the sacrificial meat during the night, roasted over fire. Eat it with matzah and bitter herbs. So this is the first mention of the commandment to eat matzah in the Torah, is in this pasuk, chapter 12, verse 8, where they're commanded in Mitzrayim to eat the Korban Pesach together with matzah. It doesn't say why, just says eat it together with matzah. Then there's they have to eat it roasted with over fire. Verse 9 says that it can't be cooked in any way, not to leave it over to the morning. Look at let's read verse 10 and 11 together. Do not leave, this is the top of page 311, do not leave any of it over until the morning. Anything that is left over until the morning must be burnt in fire. You must eat it with your waist belted, your shoes on your feet and your staff in your hand, so ready to go on the journey to leave Egypt. And you must eat it in haste. This is a very important word. You must eat the Korban Pesach in haste. It is a Passover offering to God. Hashem then continues to tell Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron that he will then go on to smite the Egyptian firstborns and pass over the Jewish homes. And now let's look at verse 14, at which he says, this day must be one that you will remember. You must keep it as a festival to God for all generations. So here's the first mention that Pesach is not just something that they're going to do that year, but this is something going to be for generations to come. It is a law for all time that you must celebrate it. How do you celebrate it in all times? Eat matzahs for 7 days. So earlier it just said eat matzah with the Korban Pesach. Here's the first mention that we have to eat matzah for 7 days. By the first day you must have your homes cleared from all chametz. Whoever eats chametz from the first day until the 7th day will have his soul cut off from Israel. The first day shall be a sacred holiday. The 7th day shall also be a sacred holiday. So that's why the first and last day of Pesach, or in the diaspora, the first 2 and last 2 days of Pesach are Yom Tov, forbidden from doing work, and the middle days are called Chol Hamoed. No work shall be done on those days. The only work that you may do is that which is needed that everyone will be able to eat, which is the permission to cook on Yom Tov versus on Shabbos, where it's forbidden even to cook. Now, very important, verse 17. Be careful regarding the matzahs, which means to make sure that they don't become chametz. You have to be careful they don't become chametz. Why? For on this very day... Okay, so I'm actually going to read my own translation, and then we'll look at Rabbi Kaplan's translation. In verse 17 it says, you shall guard the matzahs from becoming chametz, because on this very day I have taken you out of Egypt. Now, that at face value, that doesn't seem to make any sense, because this is 2 weeks before they left Egypt, which is why Rabbi Kaplan adds in a word, and he says, for on this very day I will have brought your masses out of Egypt. But the simple reading, the just translation of the words, is talking in past tense about a future event. Which is fair enough. The Torah is saying that you will be eating matzah, because by the time you eat matzah, in generations to come, I will have brought your masters out of Egypt. And you must carefully keep this day for all generations. It is a law for all times. Now, what it doesn't say in this pasuk is that you have to eat matzah because I took you out of Egypt. What it doesn't say is what's the connection. Why is matzah? What's the connection between eating matzah and the fact that God took us out of Egypt? It doesn't say that in this pasuk. Okay. Then it continues with more mitzvahs of Pesach, that you have to eat matzah, and you're not allowed to have chametz, you're not allowed to own chametz, etc., etc. Then in verse 21 we have Moshe Rabbeinu giving over these mitzvahs to the Jewish people. So until verse 20 it's God talking to Moses. Now Moses is giving it over to the Jewish people. I shall note that this goes from verse 21 to verse 29. Moses only gives over the mitzvah to eat the korban Pesach. He doesn't talk at all about the mitzvahs of matzah and chametz. However, that doesn't present a problem. We find that many times that the Torah only records God's commanding Moshe, and it's self-understood that Moshe also repeated this to the Jewish people. Verse 29 talks about the Makas B'chayris, that Hashem actually carried out the death of the firstborns. Paro then comes to look for the Moshe and Aaron, and he chases them out of Egypt. Then in verse 34, this is towards the top of page 315, it says, the people took their dough before it could rise. Their leftover dough was wrapped in their robes and placed on their shoulders. So they didn't have time, before it could rise, the dough didn't have time to rise, and they took the dough on their shoulders and they left Egypt. Look at verse 37. The Israelites traveled from Ramses, which is where they were living in Egypt, towards Sukkot, which Rashi actually says that this was technically a long journey, but miraculously they covered this space in a very short amount of time. There were about 600,000 adult males on foot besides the children. And look, a very strange verse 39. The Israelites baked the dough that they had brought out of Egypt into unleavened matzah's cake, since it had not risen. Now again, Rabbi Kaplan is bothered by the strangeness of the pasuk, and he translates it accordingly. But the simple reading of the pasuk says that they baked the dough which they'd taken out from Egypt into matzahs and not into chametz, because they were driven out of Egypt and didn't have time to delay for the dough to become into chametz. The most obvious problem with this pasuk is that it seems to suggest that had they had time to tarry, then they would have made chametz. Sure. Right? Now Rabbi Kaplan was very bothered by this question, and therefore he translates the pasuk slightly differently. He says that they baked the dough that they brought out of Egypt into unleavened bread since it had not risen, period. And then it says they had been driven out of Egypt and could not delay, and they had not prepared any provision. So he sort of separates the two. That one idea is they baked it because it had not risen. Doesn't say why. And then there's another thing, they happen to be in a haste. Now I'm not sure where Rabbi Kaplan gets this idea of this. I haven't seen such a, from all the Mefarshim that I looked at in the Rishonim on Chumash, I did not see anyone who translates it so. But we'll get back to this. But the obvious problem with this pasuk is that, as we have seen, they were already given the mitzvah to have matzah and to eat matzah for 7 days, not to eat chametz for 7 days, not to own chametz for 7 days. So of course they couldn't bake it chametz. They weren't allowed chametz. What's this suggestion seeming to imply that had they not had chametz, that had they had time, they would have baked it into chametz. There's one other source that's very relevant, which is all the way in Devarim, in Parshas Re'eh, which is the laning of the last day of Pesach. So that's in Re'eh, I think it's chapter 15 or 16, hold on. Page 947, verse 3. Do not eat any leaven with it. It is the korban Pesach. As part of the celebration, you shall eat matzah for 7 days. This is lechem oini, whatever that means. He translates it as hardship bread. Since you left Egypt in a rush, you will then remember the days of Egypt all the days of your life. So here again, the pasuk says that we're eating matzah to commemorate the exodus of Egypt, but here there's actually a reason added. The first time we saw it says that you eat matzah for 7 days because I have taken you out of Egypt, but it doesn't explain what the connection is. Here there's an allusion to the fact that it's because you left Egypt in a rush. You left Egypt in haste. And again, perhaps the simple implication of the pasuk is that the reason you have matzah is because you left Egypt in a haste and didn't have time to bake chametz. And again, that would seem to pose a problem for us because we know that that they had a mitzvah to eat matzah regardless of the haste. Okay.
Starting from the night before.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Now, in the Haggadah, we say as follows.
What was the reason of the eating matzah before the haste reason?
Oh, well, that's one of the questions. At the very beginning, the Torah says, "Eat matzah ki be'etzam hayom hazeh seisias tiveiseichem eretz Mitzrayim," and it doesn't explain what the connection is. Okay, in the Haggadah, one of the integral parts of the Haggadah, which Mitzvah Hashem will discuss tomorrow night in the Haggadah class, is Pesach Matzah Amara. The Mishnah says, whoever does not explain the reasons for Pesach Matzah Amara does not fulfill his obligation, and the way what that means is that he hasn't fulfilled his obligation to recount the Exodus. So part of the mitzvah to recount the Exodus is to explain the reason for these three mitzvahs. What the Mishnah says is, and then the Mishnah says, what's the reason for all these three things? Pesach Matzah Amara. When it says matzah, it says, Matzah zu shana eichlem al shuma. Why do we eat matzah? Al shem shenigalu aviseinu mitzrayim, because our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt. Period. Again, that's like the pasuk in Parshas Bo. Eat matzah because I have taken you out of Egypt. Very ambiguous. Doesn't explain what the connection is. In our text of the Haggadah, which is based on the version of.
Sorry, you said that's in the Mishnah?
That's in the Mishnah.
Okay.
Right. Our text of the Haggadah is just copy-paste of the Mishnah. However, our version, in many parts of the Haggadah are copy-paste of the Mishnah. But in our version of this piece of the Mishnah, there's an addition, which if you open Mishnah Pesachim, it's not there. But this is the version of the Rambam and the Rosh and many of the Rishonim in the Mishnah, and that's how it's imported into our Haggadah, which everyone is very familiar with because you just read it yesterday afternoon. Actually, we didn't. We skipped that. Okay, that's why I don't remember.
It's not in there.
What page is it?
It's not in there.
It is. It's in the old Siddur.
It's in the old Siddur.
There's an old Siddur right there.
Old little Siddur.
Only the Hebrew one.
No. It should be there.
Yeah,
in
right,
the
the
Siddur.
thin
No,
one.
yeah.
It's in the old small Siddur.
It should be in there.
What's in the Siddur? In the new Siddur?
No, the new Siddur. In the new Siddur, the part. It's only the part that we said
Right.
yesterday.
But this part
is
that he's referring to is not in there. I'm telling you, I think it's only in the old Hebrew printers, all Hebrew ones.
It's in the
It's in
all
the small
Hebrew.
square
I'll be back.
Siddur.
Thin.
Just get a Haggadah for heaven's sake.
Yeah, where's the Rebbe Siddur? You have to have a copy of it.
In the library, sure.
I got one at home.
Al Shumma. Shum Shelo, he's speaking.
Right, Shalom history, yeah.
That's what it says in our Haggadah.
Anyway, so the Mishnah again. The Mishnah just says, okay. So the Mishnah says that we eat matzah because we were redeemed from Egypt. But in our text of the Mishnah, the way it's imported into the Haggadah, it says, why do we eat this matzah? Because the dough of our ancestors did not have time to become chametz, to become leavened, until the King of Kings, God, blessed, the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself to them and redeemed them, as it states. And now it quotes the verse that we just read from Exodus chapter 12, that they baked the dough which they had taken out of Egypt into matzah because it wasn't chametz, because they were driven out of Egypt and didn't have time to tarry. So again, very strange. It seems to be saying that the reason we're having matzah on Pesach night is because they didn't have time for their dough to rise. And here the question is even more poignant than it is in the Chumash, because here we're specifically saying, whereas in Parshas Re'eh, for example, Deuteronomy chapter 16, or 16 or 15? 16. Whereas over there it's talking about having matzah for 7 days because you left Egypt in a rush. Here we're talking about the matzah that we're having at the Seder night. The matzah at the Seder night is because we're eating it together. That's the mitzvah of having it together with the Korban Pesach, which was given 2 weeks before they left Egypt. And over there it doesn't say in the pasuk that it's connected to Egypt. The connection to Exodus of Egypt, it says in the pasuk only regarding the mitzvah of 7 days of matzah, not with regard to. It doesn't explicitly say it with regarding to eating matzah on the Seder night. But in the Haggadah we do say it explicitly about that.
So is there really two mitzvahs here?
Well,
There's one
The
mitzvah
fact is, you don't
to-
have to eat
in the
matzah
Seder,
only on the
and
first
then there's
day.
another mitzvah to do the 7 days. Isn't there two mitzvahs?
yes and no. I'll become clear soon.
Okay.
So there are a number of ways to make sense of all of this. The Ran, in his commentary on the Mishnah in Pesachim, he uses the version of the Mishnah almost identical to the way it's imported into the Haggadah, although not with such elaboration. And he says like this, that actually there's a number of differences, like I mentioned before, between what's called Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Doros. Pesach Mitzrayim means the Pesach, the year that they left Egypt. Pesach Doros is the Pesach for generations to come. He says, and this is based on his one of the opinions in the Gemara, which he follows in this elaboration, he says that the mitzvah of Pesach Mitzrayim was only for one day, meaning the night and the day of the 15th of Nisan.
Right.
The idea that Pesach is for 7 days, that's only for Pesach Doros. So they're eating the matzah in Mitzrayim on the night of the 5th, the day follows the night, right? So it's the night of the 15th, the night going into the 15th, they're having the Pesach. They had to keep the mitzvahs of Pesach for 24 hours until the following evening, and then they were allowed to eat chametz. The Ran adds another point, which he doesn't even say it so explicitly, and he's almost taking it for granted, and the commentaries struggle with this. Why is this so obvious to him? But this is what he says. He says that the prohibition to own chametz is contingent upon Pesach being 7 days. Lo yirah lecha shivas yomim. The prohibition to own chametz is connected to Pesach being 7 days. So therefore, that first year, when Pesach was only 1 day, there was only a prohibition to eat chametz. There was no prohibition to own chametz. Therefore, he says, had they had time, when we suggest over here that had they had time to bake chametz, they would have done so. That's very reasonable, because they're about to leave Egypt. They're going on a journey. They would bake bread. They would bake chametz, and they would eat it tonight.
Might say 50.
But since they were in a hurry,
But since they were in a hurry, so what?
they
So
didn't have time.
they didn't have time to bake it into chametz. But the basis for our problems, our questions with all this is, what do you mean they didn't have time? They weren't allowed to. They were commanded. It says the Ran, no, they actually, that year, they were allowed to own chametz, and they were allowed to eat chametz the next night. So they would have done so had they had more time.
But maybe Hashem
to prepare.
didn't want them to eat chametz.
Sorry?
Maybe Hashem didn't want them.
Clearly he didn't. But there was no mitzvah for that. Now, that's one way of dealing with it, and according to that, sort of everything is going to fit in like a glove. And then we have so what we say in the Haggadah that we're having matzah because it didn't have time. So the way the Ran understands it, and this is found in the Ran doesn't say this part explicitly, but it's found in other commentaries, that the mitzvah to eat matzah was given sort of al shem ha'asid. In other words, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Neibishter knew that they were going to have to leave Egypt in a rush and not have time to bake chametz for the rest of the days, and therefore originally the original sort of point of departure of the mitzvah is to eat the Korban Pesach with matzah. But then Hashem says, actually, I'm going to give you this mitzvah for 7 days, because what's going to end up happening is that you're going to leave Egypt in a rush and not have time to make matzah, and therefore to commemorate that you're going to have matzah for 7 days. So when it says in Parshas Boy that you're going to have matzah for 7 days to remember the exodus of Egypt, it's talking al shem ha'asid, that because you're going to leave and not have time to make matzah, I'm going to give you this matzah, and not have time to make chametz, I'm going to give you this matzah for 7 days, this mitzvah for 7 days. And this also explains very clearly the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, where it says explicitly that the mitzvah of matzah is because you left Egypt in a rush. That's one approach to the subject. Another approach is offered by Ramban in his commentary on Parshas Boy, of which there is an art scroll in the library, and he says like this, that actually, of course, they never could have baked any chametz, because Hashem told them not to have chametz for 7 days. There wasn't even an option for them to consider having chametz. And he says, no, actually, you're reading the pasuk all wrong. Turn back to page 315. 315. He says you have to read it like this. I'm going to read it in the Hebrew because his translation is already taking on a certain approach. Pasuk 39. They baked the dough which they took out of Egypt into matzahs. Kiloi chametz. They were, because it couldn't be chametz. Why couldn't it be chametz? Because Hashem said, "Don't make it chametz." Why did they bake the dough that they took out of Egypt the next day in Sukkot? Why didn't they bake it in Egypt? Why didn't they make this matzah in Egypt? Kigorshu. They didn't have time to make the matzah in Egypt, so they made it the next day in Sukkot. The question here is not whether they should have made it chametz or matzah. Of course they have to make it matzah. Kiloi chametz. They're not allowed to make it into chametz. But the question is, why did they take raw dough out of Egypt and bake it in Sukkot? Why didn't they just
Flour, water.
why didn't they bake it in Egypt before they left? The answer is they didn't have time.
Kigorshu.
Kigorshu Mitzrayim, they didn't have time. How is it that how is it that it didn't become chametz all this time that they left Egypt? So either you could say that they were constantly busy with it. The Torah alludes to this and says that it was on their shoulders. Now, even though we know that matzah has to be made in 18 minutes, strictly speaking, as long as you're working the dough, it'll never become chametz. So you can work the dough for hours and hours and it doesn't become chametz. It's only once it's left alone, then it becomes chametz. So one suggestion is that it was on their shoulders and they were constantly playing around with it so that it shouldn't become chametz. The Torah says it was on their shoulders.
That's true.
Alternatively, one could suggest, and Chassidus seems to accept. I haven't seen it explicitly about this detail, but Chassidus seems to accept this idea that it was miraculous. That part of the, like we say in the Haggadah, that the revelation, the divine revelation, caused the dough to stop, not to be able to rise. And that goes with the whole approach of Chassidus, that chametz represents the Yetzer Hara, and matzah represents the bittul and the sort of submission to Hashem, and therefore, because when there's a great revelation of God, then the Yetzer Hara just falls into oblivion. The problem now. The problem with the Ramban is that he's explained very Parshas Boi, but the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, where it explicitly says that you eat matzah because you left Egypt in haste, what does that mean? What's the connection to leaving Egypt in haste and matzah, according to the Ramban? The matzah was regardless. And the problem is that the Ramban in Parshas Re'eh actually does comment on that pasuk, but he doesn't say anything about that. He doesn't say what the connection is.
And what Yochanan mentioned, why we couldn't just get flour and water separately, why we have to even mess with it?
Well, they could have, but presumably they were trying, according to the Ramban,
It seems like
they were trying to get the job done before they left, and then how do you say it sprung up on them? Suddenly parrots here telling them to get out.
Well, it doesn't seem so practical to travel with water, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
It's more practical to travel with it in the dough form. But, I mean, I was going to actually ask that. We know that they left at midday. Now, unless there are Buchram in 770, that's not like first thing in the morning, you know. You could sort of have your dough.
Does it say they left at midday, or does it say they left in daylight?
They left early in the morning.
After daylight. That's what you said means that it was in daylight. I don't think Rashi Noach says Bechatzi Hayoy, but I don't know. I also
see the Ramban holds both. Yes, there was a mitzvah of matzah, but the stress is on the fact that they did it in a rush, and it was miraculous that it didn't become chametz, and that's what we're going to focus on. Beidazachim.
Okay, that's possible. I want to go a bit deeper than that. My problem with that is that the Ramban doesn't say anywhere that there was anything miraculous. He doesn't. The question of how the dough didn't become chametz is not addressed by the Ramban at all. The Rachaim and other commentaries address that, but the Ramban himself is not. Go figure. He doesn't say why it didn't become chametz. Now, we're going to discuss now various reasons for the mitzvah of matzah, and we'll see what the Ramban could possibly mean. But I do want to say that the text of the Haggadah, the way we have it, I can't see of any way that could make sense according to the Ramban. And the Ramban probably followed the other version of the reading of the Mishnah. And I assume that in the Ramban's Haggadah it didn't say Shaloi Hispik Lahachmitz, that the dough didn't have time to become chametz, because he doesn't hold of that. He would have it just the way it is in the Mishnah, that that we eat matzah because we were redeemed from Egypt. Now again, he doesn't explain why, and that's one of the things. So what's the connection between matzah and leaving Egypt.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we ate matzah all this time, right?
okay, so we'll get there. But so there's a number of reasons, but I'm going to start with one. Matzah is a type of food that's made in haste. Bread, to make bread is a production. You have to have warm water. You have to have time to make the water warm. You have to leave the dough to rise, etc., etc. Matzah is a haste type of food, and that's what the pasuk in Parshas Re'eh means. Have matzah because you left Egypt in haste. Now, what's the idea of leaving Egypt in haste? So the Rambam writes that the reason why, he says that actually many of the mitzvahs, this is the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim, and elements of this Rambam are actually also said by the Sefer HaChinuch. Sefer HaChinuch and every mitzvah, Sefer HaChinuch follows the Rambam in many areas. The Sefer HaChinuch and every mitzvah, he starts off the first thing, again, that's 10-volume art scroll set in the library. He says, so for every mitzvah, he starts off Misharshei mitzvah. He says what a possible reason or elements of reason for the mitzvah may be. And the Sefer HaChinuch, so there's various mitzvahs in the Pesach night and the mitzvah of the Seder night that have to do with being in a rush. So matzah is one element, because matzah is a rushed type of food. But when you look at the Korban Pesach, okay, you're not allowed to cook it, you have to roast it on the fire. That's a quicker way of preparing it. You're not allowed to break the bones to get out the meat, because there's no time to mess around with that. The Torah explicitly says you have to eat, that year at least they have to eat it dressed and ready to go on the way. They're not allowed to, you're not allowed to take it into other houses, so you're not allowed to sort of take it to your neighbors and say, how does your food taste, how does my food taste, etc., etc. There may be a number of other things as well. But so the Rambam says, and some of these are also adopted by the Sefer HaChinuch, that what's the reason for all these things about eating in a rushed form? Because there was going to be the time to leave Egypt, and Hashem didn't want that people should be carried away and distracted by their delights, by their food. Because if they would get distracted, then they might miss the boat, they would be stranded in Egypt, everyone would have left, and they'll be stuck there all alone, and then the Egyptians would come and blow their head off. So, in order that the Jewish people shouldn't be in danger of being harmed by the Egyptians, Hashem says, be completely focused on doing this meal as quickly as possible. Okay? That's what the Rambam says. Now, Al-Pi, the Rambam is trying to find a very sort of pshat level, that's a Moreh Nevuchim, and the Sefer HaChinuch also says it. It's funny because the Sefer HaChinuch says it about some of the mitzvahs, but not about. In other words, the Sefer HaChinuch's theme for all of these mitzvahs, not breaking bones, not sharing it, having it roasted, etc., is all because it's derech melachim. It's the way of royalty. He says a poor person has a small piece of meat, he can't afford to roast it, because when you roast it, it shrinks. Therefore he cooks it and it becomes more, right? And a poor person is breaking the bones to get out every speck of meat. So the Sefer HaChinuch says that all of these mitzvahs are connected with being with sort of royalty or whatever. But he, by one or two of them, he also says that another possible reason is because sort of the opposite thing, that Hashem didn't want them to get stuck in Egypt.
That's the same thing like matzah. Like a matzah is slavery and it's freedom.
Right,
So
exactly.
One hand it's royalty, the other hand it's Russian.
Right, exactly. The Rambam also says both, in two different chapters of Moreh Nevuchim, he says both of those things. I'm going to get back to that. So, but the same concept, perhaps on a more mystical or deeper or Chassidus perspective, is that, I'm sure this concept is familiar to everybody, that the Jewish people in Mitzrayim were sunken in what we call the Memtesh Shari Tumah, whatever that means, sort of the lowest of the low. And Elu Ikvan Afilu Karafayim, that if they had stayed in Egypt even one extra second, then it would have been damaged beyond repair. As we say, for example, in Avodim Hayinu, that if Hashem had not taken us out of Egypt, we would still be in Egypt. What do you mean we would still be in Egypt? Hashem told Abraham it would only be for 400 years. But the idea is that we would have been so far gone that even when Hashem redeemed us, we wouldn't have left. We would have just stayed there, right? So it's not about, well, somebody's going to be left over and an Egyptian's going to come and find him and hurt him, but it's about our spiritual danger, that Hashem wants to make sure we don't get carried away with all this food, because He doesn't want us to stay in our neshamas to be left in the impurity of Egypt for one extra second, and therefore He commanded us to do to eat the Pesach in this way, and that is also one of the reasons for for the mitzvah of matzah. That matzah is is a type of food of haste. Now, based on this, there could be another pshat in the Haggadah, because before I told you that the Ran must understand the concept that when Hashem says 2 weeks before the exodus of Egypt, eat matzah because you're going to go, because I taken you out of Egypt. What's the connections? I said, well, the Ran has to understand that this is sort of said al shem ha'asid. How would you say that in English?
In the future, it's a description of what.
It's a description of what will happen. In other words, because it happens to be that you're not going to have time to make chametz. So therefore, I'm going to give you up this mitzvah of matzah to preempt, right? But well, I don't know if preempt is the right word here, because I'm going to give you the matzah in generations to come. That year there was no mitzvah of matzah for more than the one night or the one day.
It's still preemptive.
Okay, preemptive. but so therefore the mitzvah Shema Asid. But according to this approach, it's not al Shema Asid. This was part of the plan. Being b'chipazon, being in a rush, was integral to the master plan of the exodus of Egypt. That you had to be in a rush so that you won't get stuck in Egypt, whether it's because of the physical dangers or the spiritual dangers. So therefore, it's not just al shema asid that it happens to be that you're not going to have time to make comments and therefore there's going to be a mitzvah of matzah. It's right now, ahead of time, I'm telling you, do this in a rush, because the whole idea of exodus of Egypt is that in order for this to work, it must be done in a rush.
So you want to have a second thought.
What?
So you want to have
Right.
a second thought.
Now, I want to add that there's an interesting addition. In our Haggadah, we say that why do we eat this matzah? Because the dough didn't have time to rise and to become chametz until Hashem revealed Himself to them. According to this understanding of it, yes, it's true that the dough didn't have time to rise, and otherwise it would have become chametz. But it was all because they had a mitzvah. In other words, it's as if to say, the point is not the fact that they didn't have time to rise. The point is that they were in a rush. They had a mitzvah not to have chametz because they were going to be in a rush. Being in a rush was part of the thing. Now, so
the rush was part of the plan.
In other words, what's the emphasis? When you read this paragraph in the Haggadah, we eat matzah because the dough didn't have time to rise until HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed Himself to them and redeemed them in a rush. So the emphasis is that He redeemed them in a rush. The fact that didn't have time to become chametz is almost parenthetic. It didn't have time to become chametz. Why? Because there was a mitzvah to do so, because they were going to have to be redeemed in a rush. And I noticed that in the Rambam's Haggadah, he adds a word that we don't say in our Haggadah, but it emphasizes very much the rush part. He says, "Ad shenigla aleim melech malchem lochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu ga'olam miyad." Miyad. He adds in the, so again, that means immediately. The Rambam is emphasizing here, yes, it's true that the reason they had matzah was because it didn't have time to rise. But that's not the emphasis over here. The emphasis is that Yetzias Mitzrayim, in order for it to be a successful venture, it had to be carried out in a rush. Now, somebody alluded to, and maybe I think Mark might have suggested this. The Taz there's a pirush from the Taz on Chumash, on Rashi, which actually the Rebbe was very fond of. The Rebbe quoted it a lot. It was published by Moshe Rav Kook. I think it was first. In our generation, it was published by a print house which was called Vad Makitzei Nirdamim or something. They used to find obscure Sfarim and republish them. Nowadays, nowadays we have all these digital books, so that's the sort of. But in those days, there was this group of people in New York in the 60s and 70s who would find these obscure svarim and print them. So he tries to sort of synthesize between the various understandings, and he says that even according to the Ramban, who says that there was a mitzvah and they weren't allowed to eat chametz, and it wasn't like they had any choice to make a chametz. He says actually it's a bit of both. He says they weren't sure. There was two ways to understand the psukim. Does it mean that they weren't allowed to have chametz just for the one day, or they weren't allowed to have chametz for the whole Pesach? So they didn't know what to do. But then, because sort of b'hashgacha pratis, Hashem coordinated it such that the dough wouldn't have time to rise, so therefore they understood that must be the way to do it, that we don't have chametz for 7 days. Now, this question of what does it mean that we say in the Haggadah that we're having matzah because he didn't have time to rise, when clearly there was a mitzvah of Pesach for 7 days, is asked in many Memori Chassidus, and Chassidus seems to accept for the most part. The Chassidus in various Memorim it says slightly different answers, but for the most part Chassidus does quote and seem to accept this opinion that year the mitzvah of Pesach for that first year was actually only for 1 day.
Isn't that a Ferisha Gemara?
No, it's an opinion in the Gemara. It's a shit of Rabbi Eliyahu Rapoport in the Gemara. Chassidus adds another dimension to this whole discussion, and that is as follows: that because if you remember, I asked before that the mitzvah to have matzah on the Seder night is connected to the mitzvah to have matzah with the Korban Pesach, which is regardless of this whole discussion of whether they would have made chametz, they could have made chametz. That's regardless. There's a mitzvah to have matzah with the Korban Pesach. Now, why is there a mitzvah to have matzah with the Korban Pesach? What's matzah got to do with anything? In other words, if we're saying that matzah, until now we've suggested that matzah is connected to the haste to leaving Egypt, but I'm saying now that there's another idea of having matzah with the Korban Pesach. So what's that about? So that's what Ariel was alluding to before, and I'll get there in a moment. But what Chassidus says is, so why are we having the matzah that we're having at the Seder night and saying that this is connected to leaving Egypt in a haste? So Chassidus says that actually there's two levels of matzah. Matzah is matzah. The matzah that they had beforehand was what Chassidus says is matzah without the vav. It's without the extra divine energy in it. And then there's the matzah that they had afterwards, which was a result of, in the words of the Haggadah, the revelation of the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. So that was sort of infused with extra light. Now, that was then, but nowadays, because we're after Matan Torah and everything we do is a mitzvah, and it comes after the preparations to Pesach, so therefore our matzah that we have as the first matzah, the matzah that we're eating on the night before, is actually a double header because it has both aspects of matzah in it. So in that year of Egypt, they had only matzah the first day, and matzah the night with the Korban Pesach, and the rest of the matzah. Whereas nowadays we have 2 in 1. You go to Sam's Club, everything nowadays is 2 in 1. Now, you see, Begashmis it doesn't always work because, in Europe we're more into quality than in America. So you do shampoo and conditioner 2 in 1. It's not shampoo, it's not conditioner. You have a washing machine and dryer 2 in 1. It doesn't wash your clothes, it doesn't dry them. But in Ruchnius it works. You could have matzah 2 in 1, and it works perfectly every year. Now, why is it that why should I want to sort of go a bit more into the why? So why should it taka be that the mitzvah of Pesach Mitzrayim, that Pesach that year was only 1 day? Why should Pesach only be 1 day? If Pesach is 7 days, why should it only be 1 day that year? So
Pesach in the years is 7 days. But Pesach then was 1 day.
Why?
Well, it was on Pesach. That's 1 day. God passed over their homes.
So why do we have to commemorate it for 7 days now and only for 1 day?
Then there was a miracle at the end when they split the sea, so we didn't realize at that moment. You think, well, I'm out of Egypt. That's it.
But we're saying we're saying that the splitting the sea is a separate thing. We're saying that the mitzvah of matzah is for 7 days.
How long did it last?
Matzah, well, again,
They made Seder Ladera, right?
No, they didn't make Seder Derech.
Well, they made the matzah as Seder Ladera.
Right, and then they had that
How
for a
long did it
month.
last?
For a month, till Rashi says, till
They do it for a month.
You should have been a
Ask your wife why.
Or the kids.
So, no, again, we've until now explained how the mitzvah of matzah is connected explicitly to the haste of leaving Egypt. That's not connected to Kriyas Yamsuf. And in fact, Chassidus actually says that Yam Sov happens after 6 days of eating matzah, whatever. But again, on a pshat level, I want to. In fact, the theme of this class has been very much going from the pshat into the Chassidus. So I started off with the pshat, different opinions of the matzah, and then explain what Chassidus has to say. And I want to do the same with Pesach being 1 day versus 7 days. So here's a suggestion as follows. Again, we've explained how Matzah is commemorating the redemption from Egypt. But actually, as Ariel mentioned before, Matzah also commemorates the difficulty, the hardships of Egypt, which is one of the reasons why the Torah calls it lechem oini, the bread of, what Rabbi Kaplan translates, I think, the bread of hardship, the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, whatever you want to call it. And in fact, this is also what we say in the Haggadah, actually just before the Haggadah, or the introduction to the Haggadah, where we say, hey lach ma'anya di'achol avasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim. This is the bread of affliction that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. So why would they have ate matzah in the land of Egypt? So there's in Rishonim, many commentaries mention this idea that they had matzah in Egypt. Why would they have done so? So there's various options. I just remember right now two of them. One is that, again, like we said before, matzah is something that takes a process. You have to have water, you have to warm up the water, you have to wait for it to rise. The slave comes home from a hard day of work. He don't have any time to make any bread. He just slaps something into the oven and puts a timer on 5 minutes, and he wants to eat right away.
No microwaves. Did the women
In
work
that
too?
case, matzah should be
Yeah.
cheaper than
Women's
bread.
world is part.
And then
Right? That's one suggestion. Hold on 1 second. Hold on, let me.
relevant.
Well, I know it's relevant, but I don't want to lose my train. Another thing, which is a little bit of a different twist, which I've seen in some Rishonim, that matzah is a food, and actually this is probably particularly true about the matzah that they had then, which was the soft, soft lava. It wasn't really a lava like we have. I mean, I've tasted it. Rabin, So I tasted it once. I waited till after Pesach. I tasted it, but it's difficult to digest, and it stays in your system for longer than regular food. So they said that the slave masters would feed their slaves that type of food, so that they would get away with feeding them less. Right. So it's about remembering the hardships of Egypt.
So it wasn't $30 pound shmur matzah that we're feeding.
Oh no. Now the Rambam says. So what the Rambam says over there in Moreh Nevuchim is that why do we commemorate the hardships of Egypt on Pesach? Again, according to this approach, that matzah is the hardship. Why are we commemorating it on Pesach? So he says in order to fully appreciate the appreciation of the miracle and the exodus and the freedom that Hashem has given us, you need to know where you're coming from. You know the famous story of the Meshulach who comes to the door and he makes the guy stand out in the cold for half an hour, and he keeps on inviting him in, and he says, "No, I'm fine, I'll stay right here." And then eventually he comes in, but then when he tells him that this kid's freezing in Russia, he actually feels for it.
Yeah.
So it's the idea. He says, he says actually a similar idea of sukkahs. He says that we go outside into the sukkah and discomfort ourselves, so that we recognize the beauty of the miracle of the Adani HaKavod or whatever it was. Now he says over there, why is it for 7 days? The Rambam doesn't talk about whether or not Pesach Mitzrayim was 1 day. He just talks about why in general Pesach is 7 days, and he says that 7 days is a unit. He says in many areas of science, in medicine and whatever, 7 days, you do something for 7 days, it has an effect on a person. So he says, if you just change your diet and eat matzah for a day or 2 or 3, it's not gonna, whatever, it happens sometimes that you don't eat bread for a couple of days. But he says in order for it to really affect you have to do it for a complete unit of time, which is 7 days. That's what the Rambam says. Now the Rambam doesn't discuss whether or not Pesach Mitzrayim was 1 day or 7 days, but I would like to suggest that the reason why Pesach Mitzrayim was 1 day is because they weren't trying to commemorate anything. They were right there. They were living this. They didn't need to commemorate and try and remember and do some rituals for 7 days to remember the hardships, and therefore it wasn't necessary for them to do it for 7 days. Now, so that's on a pshat level. Chassidus actually says something deeper than that, obviously. It says like this, that, you know what, I'm actually going to say one more thing and then I'll say, I'll get to the Chassidus says afterwards. I saw another thing, a historical essay by somebody, which I found very interesting. He says that actually from the beginning of history, the normal food that people had was matzah. Again, not the cracker amount. They made a dough and they baked it right away. The sophistication of civilization, the peak of which was Egypt, they are the ones who came up with this idea of bread, of leaving the dough and letting it rise and become into this fluffy bread. So, for example, we find before Mitzrayim in the Torah, we find that Avraham gave the Malachim Matzah, Lot gave the Malachim Matzah. So Rashi says, brings based on the Midrashim that because it was Pesach. But on a more pshat level, you could just suggest that was just a normal thing to do. People ate matzah. Bread, chametz bread, was the symbol of the haskalah, of the sort of advanced society, right? So, not eating chametz and eating matzah is sort of the statement that actually we're not assimilating into Egyptian culture, which also fits with the way we look at matzah and chametz versus as matzah being the bittul and chametz being the Yetzer Hara, right? It's the symbol of Egypt.
I had a question: why in the Beis Hamikdash they had lechem apanim, big loaves?
No, that was all matzah. No, it wasn't. The lechem apanim was matzah. The lechem apanim was not chametz. The only chametz in the Beis Hamikdash was the shtei alechem on Shavuos, which comes, as Chassidus explains, after the whole birur of the Yemei HaSfira, and 10 out of the 40 loaves that came. You should know this. This was the mistaken landing yesterday. 10 of the 40 loaves that came with the carbon toida al chalois lechem, chalas chalois, were also chametz. And Chassidus explains why Dafka the carbon toida was able to have chametz beyond the scope, and also I don't remember. So even if it would be in the scope, I wouldn't remember. Okay. Why? So that's I've explained to you the pshat level of why, a possible pshat level of why that year Pesach was only for one day. But Chassidus also asks the question: why was Pesach only one day that year? And the Alter Rebbe in Likutei Torah offers the following explanation. He says, Yom Tov is a mitzvah of simcha. And I want to say that it says in Sfarim, I don't know where, but I've said this. It says in Sfarim that a Baal Esek, somebody who's involved in in business or in worldly affairs, sees Hashgacha Pratis much more than a Yoshev Oil. Somebody who's learning Torah, you don't get the opportunity to see Hashgacha Pratis. You're out there in the world and you see Hashem's hand controlling things. That's you see more Hashgacha Pratis. And it says that somebody who's learning Torah, for him, he sees Hashgacha Pratis in that when you're learning a certain concept in Torah and you by chance come across something which helps you understand it better, so then that's the Hashgacha Pratis. So that happened to me this morning when this is the concept which I learned in the Likutei Torah yesterday, and then as I was thinking over the class, I opened today's Tanya and I saw he has one paragraph which explains this concept nicely. But in this Tanya. But basically, the Alter Rebbe explains in the Likutei Torah that on Yom Tov there's a mitzvah of simcha. Why is there a mitzvah of simcha, of rejoicing on Yom Tov? Because Yom Tov is bina. Bina is when you have a concept and you fully grasp it and you sort of have it. There's a certain satisfaction. There's a certain, I got it. It becomes very tangible, and that's when you could sort of really appreciate it and feel b'simcha. However, in order you can't just have the bina without the chachma. The chachma is having the information, and then bina is the first step of internalizing it. Now, really internalizing it affects you emotionally, that's das. But internalizing it intellectually, that's bina. So, in order to have simcha on Yom Tov, that's why we have simcha on Yom Tov, because aim habad b'smeicha, the mother is bina, because the mother is the one who takes the drop or the little thing and expands it and develops it through the 9 months of pregnancy. So that's why the mother is bina, and aim habad b'smeicha on halal. We say halal on Yom Tov, we say that the mother is simcha. Because the bina, the simcha comes when something is tangible and you see all the details clearly and it becomes meaningful in that way, that creates simcha. But of course, just having the bina without the chachma doesn't work. The bina can only come after the chachma, and the chachma is the sort of the core detail in the mashal of the mother and the father. That would be the sperm, but it's the core detail of what it's about. In order to appreciate the chachma, you have to have bittul. You have to be open to the experience. And this is the part. I'll just read you a few lines from here. He says, normally your chachma and bina work together in your mind doing opposite jobs. Chachma collects information from the outside and bina processes it on the inside. To do that, chachma needs to be in a state of wonderment, openness, and humility. It needs to be detached from yourself. If you were constantly preoccupied with what ideas and events meant to you, you would be a bad listener. You would never hear what another person is really saying because 100% of your attention would be on noting your own reaction. So for Chachma to do its job and receive wisdom from the outside, it must be totally detached from self and focused entirely on the other. Right? So I just like the way he put that. So therefore, Chassidus explains like this. That's why we have matzah on Pesach, because Pesach is bina, it's simcha, but matzah, the dogon, is what gives you the chokhmah. For example, it brings the idea that a child, that a child can't call his father, one doesn't know how to call father until he tastes the tastes of grain. Now, Abba is chokhmah. Like I said, the mother is bina, the father is chokhmah. So the grain is what the grain of the matzah is what instills this bittul. So therefore we need to have matzah for 7 days, but because in order to instill this bittul into the bina, says that's what we need to do. But the Jews leaving Egypt, they had Moshe and Aaron right there, and he explains how Moshe and Aaron they fulfilled, they sort of accomplished the same thing that matzah would accomplish, because they say Moshe and Aaron. It says that Moshe and Aaron come from the Nekudas Abba. Moshe and Aaron are neshamas of Atzilus, which is the world of Chachma. So they sort of were very embodiment of Chachma in a very tangible, real way to the Jewish people. And also in the Schus of Aaron with the Anani HaKavod with the clouds of glory, which was Mesame Ein HaChetzonim, which means it. In short, it means that sort of facilitated bittul. It facilitated this state of bittul because it got rid of any distractions from being focused on the chachma, and therefore they only needed to have it for 1 day. Okay, I guess I'll take your question.
That would question then the stories that we hear about tzaddikim or rabbeim, that because of the chashash of chametz, they only eat matzah 1 day and not the whole 7 days.
Okay, I'm getting there.
You're over.
No, I said I'll take questions.
Look, every minute you're here is one less minute cleaning for Pesach.
Well,
On page 390,
yeah,
it refers to the showbread.
yeah.
In the base of mikdash, and it says that the thickness was only 0.58 inch, which is a little bit over a half inch. So therefore, it wasn't that fluffy bread. It was thin.
Yeah, well, it was bent over, so it did look tall in the end. But yeah, it wasn't the thing. Okay, so Reb Shalom is asking if we need to have matzah for 7 days in order to make sure our bina is not focused on ourselves, but it's focused on real simcha of Hashem, of kedusha. So what's this business that some people only have matzah for 1 day? The Alter Rebbe himself in the Torah preempts that question, and he says that even though in order to do this you have to have matzah for 7 days, it's actually enough just not to have chametz. And that's why the mitzvah of matzah, the obligatory mitzvah that you must eat matzah, is only the first day, or you have 2 days Yom Tov, so the first 2 days, the first 2 nights, and after that it's rishus. It's only optional to have matzah, and it's enough not to have chametz, and that sort of quote does the trick. I wanted to should we continue a few more minutes?
So is it really the fact, Rabbi? So it's really the fact that if you continue to eat the matzah for the 7 days, in your mind, you're doing so in order not to eat the chametz.
Right. Okay. So I want to address on a pshat and on a practical level the eating matzah the first night versus eating matzah the rest of Pesach. Everyone knows that one must eat matzah the first night of Pesach during this 2 starim, the first nights of Pesach. The rest of Pesach, if you don't want to, you can eat chametz, but you don't have to eat matzah. I think everybody knows that. Question is why? It's explicit in the Torah a number of times that you have to eat matzah for 7 days. So why would you say you don't have to eat matzah for 7 days? So this is, the Gemara learns this out based on one of the Midrash HaTorah Nidrashas. Every day before davening we say B'shloshos Midrash HaTorah Nidrashas. There's 13 methods through which we could extrapolate what the Torah means. One of the methods is which means that when we have a general rule and then there's an exception to the rule, then we say that and then there's an exception to part of the rule, we will then apply that exception to the entire rule. So it says a number of times eat matzahs for 7 days, but then there's one place where it says eat matzahs for 6 days, and on the 7th day it's Yom Tov.
Really?
Now, Sheish Yom Tov matzahs of Yom Hashvi Chag LaHashem. What that tells you is that there's an exception to part of the rule, that even though until now we had a rule that you have to have matzahs for 7 days, now it's told us that actually on the 7th day you don't need to have matzah. Once it's told us on the 7th day we don't have matzah, we apply that to the entire Yom Tov, and we say that actually the whole time you don't have to have matzah, and all the times where the Torah says you need to have matzah, it's just a way of saying you don't have chometz. You have matzah. If you want bread, you have to have matzah, but you don't have to have matzah. But it doesn't apply, the exception to the rule doesn't apply to the first night, because there it explicitly says, Ba'erev Toichel Matzahs, you have to have matzahs on the first night. Now, in the practical application of this, there are various opinions. The most extreme opinion is that even though we say that the matzah, the rest of the 7 days, is optional, actually that's just misleading. There are some things which are called, quote, optional, but they're not really optional. For example, in the Gemara it says that Tfilas Arvis Rishus, it's optional to daven Ma'ariv, but actually it's not optional to daven Ma'ariv, you have to daven Ma'ariv. Now, why is it called optional? Well, it's optional meaning it's less severe. There's the historical element, but basically optional just means that it's less strictly mandatory or enforceable than davening Shachris Mincha. So the most extreme approach to this, and this is the approach adopted by the Vilna Gaon, for example, that you have to eat matzah all the 7, every day of Pesach you have to have matzah. It's not as strict an obligation as it is the first night of Pesach. Now, and then there's varying degrees of that. The Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch, actually it's interesting, I just read a whole article from somebody who was trying to be medayik, trying to infer from various lines in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. The Alter Rebbe also holds that there's some element of obligation to eating matzah all the rest of Pesach. But then after I read that article, I saw a letter from the Rebbe where he addresses, obviously not that article, which was just written this year, but somebody else had clearly suggested the same thing many years ago, and the Rebbe says that it can't be that that's pshat in the Alter Rebbe. According to the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, it's very explicit that there's no obligation whatsoever to have matzah the rest of Pesach. However, having said that, there are a number of places in Chassidus where it talks about the tremendous value of eating matzah the rest of the 6 days of Pesach, or the rest of the 7 days of Pesach, and how dafka something that's optional has even, how Chassidus everything is backwards, right? So dafka something that's optional has a more potent potential, and so in a number of places in Chassidus, and the Rebbe actually referenced this in one of the letters for Pesach, that there is a value in eating matzah the rest of the year. Now, it's not a contradiction. Al pi halacha, you want to know what the halacha is? There's no obligation, according to Alter Rebbe, there's no halachic obligation whatsoever. Well, it's not so clear to say that because of Shabbos and Yom Tov there is an obligation of Lechem Mishnah and to eat bread, but that's not as strict an obligation. If you have an upset stomach or whatever, you could hear Lechem Mishnah from somebody else. That the obligation to have bread on every Yom Tov or every Shabbos is easier to circumvent, so to speak. I don't mean any disrespect. It's easier to get around than would be according to those opinions that's a mitzvah to have matzah every day of Pesach. But according to Alter Rebbe, al pi halacha, there's no obligation. Having said that, al pi Chassidus, there is such a concept. Now it's actually masim. It actually makes sense that there should be such a thing al pi Chassidus, because we know that every day you have to have 2 oisos. You have to have 2 signs of your connection with Hashem. One ois is the ois of bris milah. The other ois is the ois of tefillin. Now on Shabbos we don't wear tefillin because we have 2 other oises, the ois of bris milah and the ois of Shabbos. The ois means the sign or symbol, whatever. So why don't we wear tefillin on Yom Tov? So there is a because you have the ois of Yom Tov. Now what about Chol Hamoed? So everyone knows that there's machlokes whether or not you wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed. But we follow the opinion, which is the opinion amongst others, it's also the opinion of the Mekubalim, of the Zohar, that it's absolutely you're not allowed to wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed. Now, if you say you don't wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed, there has to be a second ois. So what's the second ois of Chol Hamoed? So some suggest, well, the ois is that you're not eating chametz. But it's more of that's sort of a passive negative thing. It's more geschmack to say that the ois is that there's a mitzvah to eat matzah.
And that wouldn't work for Chol Hamoed Sukkos either.
Well, then there's a mitzvah to eat in the sukkah.
Right.
Right? Okay. Okay. So that's as far as matzah the rest of Pesach is concerned. Halachically, there's no obligation, but al pi Chassidus, the Pi Pnimis Yonim, there is a inyan, there is some value in doing so. However, I've mentioned a number of times, and I'll mention again to remind you as close as possible to the time, that the only thing that's actually an obligation besides, of course, the Seder nights or whatever, but for the rest of the 8 days of Pesach, including Chol Hamoed, the only thing that's an obligation to consume for males over the age of 13 is a revius of wine. Every single day, men are obligated to Yom Tov and Chol Hamoed. Anyone over the age of 13 must have a revius of wine, not grape juice, wine. And sorry, you can't substitute. You can add it, and it's not obligatory. Also, meat. When I say meat, I don't mean poultry. I mean meat.
Red meat.
Well, is lamb also called red meat?
Yeah.
So red meat. It's not obligatory to have on Yom Tov and Chol Hamoed, but it's definitely, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, which I forget, but I would paraphrase them as highly recommended, and therefore make sure you have plenty of meat over Pesach.
But the wine is obligatory?
What?
The wine.
The wine is obligatory. If a person struggles with wine, ask your local competent Orthodox rabbi, but otherwise, make sure you have wine on Pesach, and the rest of my notes will have to wait for next year. Shkoyach for listening.
It's not